In this video, I'm going to build a to-do taskless application from scratch and take advantage of the new Ajax features in the Atlas release. If you want to follow along, you can do it either with the free Visual Web Developer Express IDE that's available or using Visual Studio. So to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and just say File, New Website. When I install Atlas, you'll notice there's an Atlas website icon on the bottom left. I can just go ahead and use that and name this project. We'll call it, task list. It's going to go ahead and create an empty project for me. It has a few files in there by default, including a README, a EULA, as well as a sample page. To begin with, I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of these because I want to type all the code you're going to use from scratch within my application. And now all that's left is the Atlas assembly, as well as a web.config file that contains references for the Atlas controls. So we're going to build this thing from scratch. So the first thing I want to go ahead and do is add a database. It's going to store my task list data. And so I'm just going to select the database icon in the Add New Item list, call it Tasks. It's going to prompt me where I want to save it. I'm going to use SQL Express for this particular sample. It's a free database that's available. You'll notice this new database is now empty. I can add a new table into it. And I'm just going to create a very simple table to hold our task information. So I'll have a task ID, which will just have be an integer. We'll go ahead and have the name of the task, which will just be a variable length character of 50. And then I'm just going to have a Boolean field to indicate whether or not this task is complete or not. So we'll just make it a bit field. And we'll go ahead and make the task ID our primary key. And then I'm just going to go ahead and set it up so that this key or this value increments every time automatically when we create a new row in the database. And now I have a table. We'll go ahead and save it, and we'll call it tasks. And I can now even go ahead and put some sample data in it. So just say show table data. All these data features are available again in the free Visual Web Developer Express tool that you can download. And to begin with here, we're just going to go ahead and add some sample data. So the first thing we'll say populate some data. And since we're not, well, I guess we did do that. We'll mark this true. We'll go ahead and add two other items, one to build our pages. We haven't done this yet, so we'll mark it false. And then we're going to go ahead and in a little bit Ajax enable those pages using Atlas. And so we'll add another task in there. We'll mark it false as well. So we have some data in our database now. Let's go ahead and start to use and take advantage of it. So I could program directly against the database, or instead what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to create what's called a data access layer. And to do that, I'm going to select the data set icon in my Add New Item. And I'm going to call this tasks. And what this is going to do is it's going to give me a programmatic API against my database data. And that way I can use it across multiple pages, and I can more cleanly separate out my data logic from my UI. I'm going to bind this against, I'm going to go against the tasks database. I can save my connection string in my web.config file so I don't have to hard code it. And now I can go ahead and use my data. And so specifically, I'm going to go ahead and add bring up the query builder here, and I'm going to go ahead and construct a SQL query. And I'm going to pull all the data from that task database. I'm going to set a filter here called where complete is equal to is complete. That way I can go ahead and only get the data that's done or not done. And I'm going to name this method getTasks by status. Now I have a simple data access layer with a method called getTasks by status that I can go ahead and use. You can see here I can test out this database data access layer. I can return all the values that are true. And then we could test out and return all the values that are false. And yep, there's the data we put in our database. And now I can go ahead and save this task list data access layer and go ahead and start building some pages to use it. So to begin with, I'm actually going to create what's called a master page, which is a new feature in ASP.NET. So I'm just going to call this site.master. And provides a nice, clean way for me to go ahead and have multiple pages on my site inherit a common look and feel or a common layout. ASP.NET will then, at runtime on the server, send down a single page, but this makes it much easier to organize my data. So to help out, I'm going to go ahead and just add a style sheet as well as some images into my project. That's the only thing I'm adding to the project. Everything else I'm going to type from scratch. I'm going to add a reference to that CSS style sheet to the top of my page. And now I can go ahead and take advantage of it. So we'll add a header div at the top, and we'll just give this page a title. It's my task list, so I'll just call it, Scott's to-do list. I can then go ahead and also add a simple class here for my content. And I can go ahead and say wrap anything I want to in there. I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it around this content placeholder and this other inner div. That way I could maybe add a menu a bit later. And we'll just call this content here products. And I'm going to have a content placeholder. It's going to let me go ahead and fill in then the content with each new page that I create. So we have a simple master page. Let's go ahead now and build a page that uses it. So I'll select here this web form icon. I'll call it to-do list. I chose to base it on a master page. So it's going to give me an option to go ahead and select that and use it. And now you can see here's this master page we created. It's an empty page, but because it's based on a master page, it gives me a nice WYSIWYG rendering of what it looks like. And at runtime, it'll actually merge whatever content I put in here with my master page. First thing I'm going to go ahead and do then within this page that's based on this master is just go ahead and provide some UI to let someone filter whether or not they want to see all the to-do list items or just the active ones. And so to enable that, I'm going to go ahead and add a nice little div here with some status. And I'm going to go ahead and add then a drop-down list control from my toolbox palette, which will let me go ahead and choose what filter I want to see on my to-do list items. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to add 2 items in the drop-down list. One I'll just call active, which is going to be my active items. Because it's going to go ahead and pass in a parameter to that DAL method we created. I'm going to say false because these are not complete items. And then this one here we're going to call completed. And I'm going to pass in true because I want to get those items where complete is set to true in the database. And I'll just enable it to be posted back. And then I can go ahead and add another CSS item in my source view. I'm just going to call it to-do header. And we'll just give it a title here called to-do list. I'm then going to go ahead and add another control to my page, which is a grid view control. And so this is a new ASP.NET 2.0 control. And what I want to go ahead and do with this grid view is I'm just going to add a CSS style sheet. So again, all the styling we're doing here is with CSS. I'm also going to add what's called an alternating item style rule, which is going to be called even, which is going to go ahead and let me alternate the color scheme of each item in the grid and apply different styling there. And I'm just going to turn off grid lines. And now if I flip into design mode here, you can see my grid. I can go ahead now and bind to a data source. And so I can go ahead now and bind to that data access layer that we created. So I'm going to select object. And I'm going to go ahead and pick the task list data access layer that we built. And you can see here I can configure what methods I want for each of these items. I'm going to call that data access method that we created. It has that isComplete parameter, remember. And I'm going to bind that value against the drop-down list control on the page. I can, if I want to, I can get rid of, for example, this task ID column. I don't really need it. So I can just select it and choose to remove that column. Make it a little bit friendlier for users. I can enable paging, sorting, and editing on that grid. And then I can go ahead and run it. You'll notice that our built-in web server pops up in the bottom right. That's a web server that ships with Visual Web Developer Express and Visual Studio, so I don't need to have IIS or anything. I can just basically just run this project and I'm good to go. You can see now I can filter based on the data we entered. I can go ahead now and, for example, edit those items. So, hey, we've built some pages, so we can mark that item as complete. Hit update. We update the database, and I can go ahead and say Atlas enable. Actually, we'll spell it right. Get rid of the E there. I can change my drop down. You can see now I'm filtering. That's that build some ASP.NET pages that we marked completes now in that item. I have a very simple page. So in addition to simply showing and editing the data, I also want to have the ability to insert new data. So I'm going to go ahead and add another div here. We'll call insert header, and just add some text here to prompt the user to add a new task to our list. And then to add the new task, I'm going to use another new ASP.NET 2.0 control called the details view control. What that lets me do is go ahead and work on a single record or a single item within our data access layer. And so I'll again use CSS to style it. So we just get rid of that height and width, and we'll just go ahead and actually set up a CSS rule called details view and get rid of the grid lines as well. And you can now see it in our WYSIWYG rendering. I can pull up the properties for this particular control. Actually, first I'm going to bind it to the object data source, and I'm going to enable it to support inserting. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull up the properties here, and I'm going to change the default view when you load the page from being a read-only view to actually be an insert view. That's going to let us very easily insert new items. I can save and run this page now. And now, in addition to filtering on our data and editing the data, I can now very easily add new items into our task list. So, for example, pick up some food. Hey, it goes against our data access layer. It's then going into the database, and our grid is binding against it and pulling it up. You can see now I can go ahead and we want to write less code, not more code. I can update that. I can add more items. What I'm going to trying to show here is I'm going to add a few sample items just to basically illustrate paging support. So the grid by default will support paging over our items, as well as sorting. Here you can see I can sort by either the name or the complete status. If I go in here and filter everything, it works as you'd expect in a nice cross-browser way. I can go ahead, add a few more items now into the active status here, and then we'll just go ahead and add a few more just so I can show off paging. I think we have to add one more here. There we go. Now you can go ahead and see it. I can also page on top of this data. I don't have to write any code to do this. This is sort of built in to the grid view UI control. And the beauty is it can bind against any data access layer. So it doesn't have to bind directly against the database. It can instead just bind against a nice, clean, middle tier object layer. And I'm good to go. So the downside, though, so this is nice, but one thing you'll notice is there's a bit of flashing, and that's because this site is not currently AJAX enabled. And since I want to take advantage of Atlas to show that off, what I'm going to go ahead and do next is actually walk through how I can take this exact same site and very easily AJAX enable it using Atlas. So to do that, I'm just going to go back into our page, and I'm going to add a few controls onto there. The first control I'm going to add is something called the Atlas Script Manager, which is a control that allows me to manage the script files that are going to go ahead and be used from the Atlas client-side runtime. You notice here I'm also enabling a feature called partial rendering, which is going to go ahead and allow me to very easily render only parts of the page in response to a postback event, and instead use AJAX techniques, and specifically the XML HTTP object, to go ahead and update incrementally parts of the page. And to do that, I'm going to use this new control here called the Update Panel control. And what the Update Panel control does is I can put any number I want on a page, and it allows me to identify a content region that I want to have support for incrementally rendering. So for example, I'm going to put the grid view within this content region. And what this means is now I can incrementally just render and update the grid view on the page and not have to update everything else. I can either cause that rendering to occur programmatically, or I can set up what's called a trigger, which is a declarative way that I can say, update this particular portion of the page when either a control event occurs or when, in this case here, my drop-down list value changes. And I can hit save, and that's it. And now I have this page AJAX enabled. So when we go ahead and run this now, you'll see when I'm doing sorting and editing, I'm only refreshing those items within the list that change. I don't actually need to repaint the entire page. I'm not having to fetch all the HTML again. Instead, only that grid is being updated. If I go ahead and remember, there's a trigger set up on that update panel control, which means that, for example, if I go ahead and change some of these values and then change the drop-down list, so for example here, if I change it to be completed, that's going to cause this grid to update, but nothing else on the page is rendering, and only the HTML that's changed is actually being sent back and forth. So, very easy to do. Let's go ahead and add another update panel. So I have any number I want here. I can also go ahead and on each update panel, so in this case here, actually, I'm just going to go ahead and put in our details view control. You'll notice here there's a mode property I can actually set on the update panel. And this is going to let me indicate whether I always want to render it or just conditionally. And that means I can have any number of panels on the page, and I can have different conditions as to when certain ones render and when other ones don't. So in this case here, I'm just going to add the details view control. And I only want it to render if the details view control is invoked or if an operation occurs on it. So if I wanted to have it be driven on an external event, I could add another trigger and point to another control. But in this case here, I'm just going to leave it like this. And by default, the update panel will look to see, did a postback event occur from a control contained within the update panel? If it does, as you can see here, I'm re-rendering that particular data list again. But now when I change and sort on the grid, that insert details view isn't actually being modified, and no HTML is having to go back and forth between the server. So it's, as you can see, very easy for me to go ahead and have different parts of the page render and take advantage of AJAX. Now, one challenge with AJAX is it is asynchronous. And so you need to make sure as a developer that you provide consistent UI to your users as they're using the site as to when something's going back to the server, and ideally they don't click the button again and cause it to occur or cause another post back. So one of the things that we provide and built into Atlas is a new feature we call the update progress control. And what this lets me do is actually provide a template of UI that'll render when a event is going back and forth between the server and the client. So I can provide some nice, consistent UI to tell the user, hey, something's going on. So in this case here, I'm just going to add an indicator control, which is just an image, just an animated GIF. I'm just going to add some text called updating. We could style it and just use standard CSS, so I could position this anywhere I want on the page. In this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and set some colors and some font sizes. And now when I go ahead and run the page, anytime I do a callback to the server, you'll see, hey, that little updated with the indicator icon is firing. And that way the user knows what's happening. I could even fancier if I wanted to and add a cancel event. In this case here, actually, what I want to do is just to sort of show what's going to happen more commonly if it's a high latency request. I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit of code to sort of simulate a long-running thing by adding what's called an updating event, which is an event that fires every time I'm going to update the data source. And don't do this at home, but basically I'm going to put the thread to sleep for a couple seconds. So it's in milliseconds, we'll just say 2 seconds. So every time now when I update the data source, I'm going to simulate a pause in the site. You can see now when I update something, notice how it's going for 2 seconds and it's showing that nice UI. And there you go. You can now see very easily. I can go ahead and simulate a long-running request. Let's go ahead and see what it looks like in Firefox. You're probably wondering, hey, is this thing cross-browser? Of course it is. And so I can go ahead and run it again as well. Let's add a new task item. Notice again, if I update things, or in this case I'll cancel, but let's say I filter and sort, that just works. If I go ahead and update it again, change the status, you notice again the update progress thing works just fine. And I can now sort and filter in a cross-browser way using AJAX techniques. As you saw, it was super easy to do.